Chapter 25 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. Chapter 25, Part 2. No, monsieur, I'd have courage to live out every throe of anguish fate assigned me, and principle to contend for justice and liberty to the last. I see you would have made no patient Grizzle. And now, supposing fate had merely assigned you the lot of an old maid, what then? How would you have liked celibacy? Not much, certainly. An old maid's life must doubtless be void and vapid, her heart strained and empty. Had I been an old maid, I should have spent existence in efforts to fill the void and ease the aching. I should have probably failed, and died weary and disappointed, despised and of no account, like other single women. But I'm not an old maid, she added quickly. I should have been, though, but for my master. I should never have suited any man but Professor Crimsworth. No other gentleman, French, English, or Belgian, would have thought me amiable or handsome, and I doubt whether I should have cared for the approbation of many others, if I could have obtained it. Now I have been Professor Crimsworth's wife 8 years, and what is he in my eyes? Is he honourable, beloved? She stopped, her voice was cut off, her eyes suddenly suffused. She and I were standing side by side. She threw her arms round me, and strained me to her heart with passionate earnestness. The energy of her whole being glowed in her dark and then dilated eye, and crimsoned her animated cheek. Her look and movement were like inspiration. In one there was such a flash, in the other such a power. Half an hour afterwards, when she had become calm, I asked where all that wild vigour was gone, which had transformed her erewhile, and made her glance so thrilling and ardent, her action so rapid and strong. She looked down, smiling softly and passively. "I cannot tell where it is gone, monsieur," said she, "but I know that whenever it is wanted, it will come back again." Behold us now at the close of the 10 years, and we have realized an independency. The rapidity with which we attained this end had its origin in 3 reasons. Firstly, we worked so hard for it. Secondly, we had no encumbrances to delay success. Thirdly, as soon as we had capital to invest, 2 well-skilled counsellors, one in Belgium, one in England, viz. Van den Hooten and Hunsden, gave us each a word of advice as to the sort of investment to be chosen. The suggestion made was judicious, and being promptly acted on, the result proved gainful. I need not say how gainful. I communicated details to Messrs. Van den Hooten and Hunsden. Nobody else can be interested in hearing them. Accounts being wound up, and our professional connection disposed of, we both agreed that as Mammon was not our master, nor his service that in which we desired to spend our lives, as our desires were temperate and our habits unostentatious, we now had abundance to live on, abundance to leave our boy, and should besides always have a balance on hand, which, properly managed by right sympathy and unselfish activity, might help philanthropy in her enterprises, and put solace into the hand of charity. To England we now resolved to take wing. We arrived there safely. Frances realized the dream of her lifetime. We spent a whole summer and autumn in travelling from end to end of the British Isles, and afterwards passed a winter in London. Then we thought it high time to fix our residence. My heart yearned towards my native county of Shire, and it is in Shire I now live. It is in the library of my own home I am now writing. That home lies amid a sequestered and rather hilly region, 30 miles removed from X, a region whose verdure the smoke of mills has not yet sullied, whose waters still run pure, whose swells of moorland preserve in some ferny glens that lie between them the very primal wildness of nature, her moss, her bracken, her bluebells, her scents of reed and heather, her free and fresh breezes. My house is a picturesque and not too spacious dwelling, with low and long windows, a trellised and leaf-veiled porch over the front door, just now on this summer evening looking like an arch of roses and ivy. The garden is chiefly laid out in lawn, formed of the sod of the hills, with herbage short and soft as moss, full of its own peculiar flowers, tiny and star-like, embedded in the minute embroidery of their fine foliage. At the bottom of the sloping garden there is a wicket, which opens upon a lane as green as the lawn, very long, shady, and little frequented. On the turf of this lane generally appear the first daisies of spring, whence its name, Daisy Lane, serving also as a distinction to the house. It terminates, the lane I mean, in a valley full of wood, which wood, chiefly oak and beech, spreads shadowy about the vicinage of a very old mansion, one of the Elizabethan structures, much larger as well as more antique than Daisy Lane, the property and residence of an individual familiar both to me and to the reader. Yes, in Hunsden Wood, for so are those glades and that grey building with many gables and more chimneys named, abides York Hunsden, still unmarried. Never, I suppose, having yet found his ideal, though I know at least a score of young ladies within a circuit of 40 miles who would be willing to assist him in the search. The estate fell to him by the death of his father 5 years since. He has given up trade, after having made by it sufficient to pay off some encumbrances by which the family heritage was burdened. I say he abides here, but I do not think he is resident above 5 months out of the 12. He wanders from land to land, and spends some part of each winter in town. He frequently brings visitors with him when he comes to Shire, and these visitors are often foreigners. Sometimes he has a German metaphysician, sometimes a French savant. He had once a dissatisfied and savage-looking Italian, who neither sang nor played, and of whom Francis affirmed that he had tout l'air d'un conspirateur. What English guests Hunsden invites are all either men of Birmingham or Manchester, hard men, seemingly knit up in one thought, whose talk is of free trade. The foreign visitors, too, are politicians. They take a wider theme, European progress, the spread of liberal sentiments over the continent. On their mental tablets, the names of Russia, Austria, and the Pope are inscribed in red ink. I have heard some of them talk vigorous sense. Yea, I have been present at polyglot discussions in the old oak-lined dining-room at Hunsden Wood, where a singular insight was given of the sentiments entertained by resolute minds respecting old northern despotisms and old southern superstitions. Also, I have heard much twaddle, enounced chiefly in French and Deutsch, but let that pass. Hunsden himself tolerated the drivelling theorists. With the practical men he seemed leagued hand and heart. When Hunsden is staying alone at the wood, which seldom happens, he generally finds his way 2 or 3 times a week to Daisy Lane. He has a philanthropic motive for coming to smoke his cigar in our porch on summer evenings. He says he does it to kill the earwigs amongst the roses, with which insects, but for his benevolent fumigations, he intimates we should certainly be overrun. On wet days, too, we are almost sure to see him. According to him, it gets on time to work me into lunacy by treading on my mental corns, or to force from Mrs. Crimsworth revelations of the dragon within her, by insulting the memory of Hofer and Tell. We also go frequently to Hunsden Wood, and both I and Francis relish a visit there highly. If there are other guests, their characters are an interesting study. Their conversation is exciting and strange. The absence of all local narrowness, both in the host and his chosen society, gives a metropolitan, almost a cosmopolitan, freedom and largeness to the talk. Hunsden himself is a polite man in his own house. He has, when he chooses to employ it, an inexhaustible power of entertaining guests. His very mansion, too, is interesting. The rooms look storied, the passages legendary. The low-ceilinged chambers, with their long rows of diamond-paned lattices, have an old-world, haunted air. In his travels he has collected stores of articles of vertu, which are well and tastefully disposed in his panelled or tapestried rooms. I have seen there one or two pictures and one or two pieces of statuary, which many an aristocratic connoisseur might have envied. When I and Frances have dined and spent an evening with Hunsden, he often walks home with us. His wood is large, and some of the timber is old and of huge growth. There are winding ways in it, which, pursued through glade and brake, make the walk back to Daisy Lane a somewhat long one. Many a time, when we've had the benefit of a full moon, and when the night has been mild and balmy, when, moreover, a certain nightingale has been singing, and a certain stream, hid in alders, has lent the song a soft accompaniment, the remote church bell of the one hamlet in a district of 10 miles has tolled midnight ere the lord of the wood left us at our porch. Free-flowing was his talk at such hours, and far more quiet and gentle than in the daytime and before numbers. He would then forget politics and discussion, and would dwell on the past times of his house, on his family history, on himself and on his own feelings, subjects each and all invested with a peculiar zest, for they were each and all unique. One glorious night in June, after I had been taunting him about his ideal bride, and asking him when she would come and graft her foreign beauty on the old Hunsden oak, he answered suddenly, "You call her ideal, but see, here is her shadow, and there cannot be a shadow without a substance." He had led us from the depth of the winding way into a glade from whence the beeches withdrew, leaving it open to the sky. An unclouded moon poured her light into this glade, and Hunsden held out under her beam an ivory miniature. Frances, with eagerness, examined it first; then she gave it to me, still, however, pushing her little face close to mine, and seeking in my eyes what I thought of the portrait. I thought it represented a very handsome and very individual-looking female face, with, as he had once said, straight and harmonious features. It was dark. The hair, raven black, swept not only from the brow but from the temples, seemed thrust away carelessly, as if such beauty dispensed with, nay, despised arrangement. The Italian eye looked straight into you, and an independent, determined eye it was. The mouth was as firm as fine, the chin ditto. On the back of the miniature was gilded Lucia. "That is a real head," was my conclusion. Hunsden smiled. "I think so," he replied. "All was real in Lucia." "And she was somebody you would have liked to marry, but could not." "I should certainly have liked to marry her, and that I have not done so is a proof that I could not." He repossessed himself of the miniature, now again in Frances's hand, and put it away. "What do you think of it?" he asked of my wife, as he buttoned his coat over it. "I am sure Lucia once wore chains and broke them," was the strange answer. "I do not mean matrimonial chains," she added, correcting herself, as if she feared misinterpretation, "but social chains of some sort. The face is that of one who has made an effort, and a successful and triumphant effort, to wrest some vigorous and valued faculty from insupportable constraint. And when Lucia's faculty got free, I am certain it spread wide pinions and carried her higher than..." She hesitated. "Than what?" demanded Hunsden. "Than les convenances permitted you to follow." "I think you grow spiteful, impertinent." "Lucia has trodden the stage," continued Frances. You never seriously thought of marrying her. You admired her originality, her fearlessness, her energy of body and mind. You delighted in her talent, whatever that was, whether song, dance, or dramatic representation. You worshipped her beauty, which was of the sort after your own heart, but I'm sure she filled a sphere from whence you would never have thought of taking a wife." "Ingenious," remarked Hunsden. "Whether true or not is another question. Meantime, don't you feel your little lamp of a spirit wax very pale beside such a girandole as Lucia's?" "Yes." "Candid at least, and the professor will soon be dissatisfied with the dim light you give." "Will you, monsieur?" "My sight was always too weak to endure a blaze, Frances," and we had now reached the wicket. "I said a few pages back that this is a sweet summer evening. It is. There has been a series of lovely days, and this is the loveliest. The hay is just carried from my fields; its perfume still lingers in the air. Frances proposed to me an hour or two since to take tea out on the lawn. I see the round table loaded with china placed under a certain beech. Hunsden is expected. Nay, I hear he is come. There is his voice laying down the law on some point with authority. That of Frances replies. She opposes him, of course. They are disputing about Victor, of whom Hunsden affirms that his mother is making a milksop. Mrs. Crimsworth retaliates. Better 1,000 times he should become a milksop than what he, Hunsden, calls a fine lad. And moreover, she says that if Hunsden were to become a fixture in the neighbourhood, and were not a mere comet coming and going, no one knows how, when, where, or why, she should be quite uneasy till she had got Victor away to a school at least 100 miles off, for that with his mutinous maxims and unpractical dogmas he would ruin a score of children. I have a word to say of Victor ere I shut this manuscript in my desk, but it must be a brief one, for I hear the tinkle of silver on porcelain. Victor is as little of a pretty child as I am of a handsome man, or his mother of a fine woman. He is pale and spare, with large eyes, as dark as those of Frances, and as deeply set as mine. His shape is symmetrical enough, but slight. His health is good. I never saw a child smile less than he does, nor one who knits such a formidable brow when sitting over a book that interests him, or while listening to tales of adventure, peril, or wonder, narrated by his mother, Hunsden, or myself. But though still, he is not unhappy; though serious, not morose. He has a susceptibility to pleasurable sensations almost too keen, for it amounts to enthusiasm. He learned to read in the old-fashioned way out of a spelling-book at his mother's knee, and as he got on without driving by that method, she thought it unnecessary to buy him ivory letters, or to try any of the other inducements to learning now deemed indispensable. When he could read, he became a glutton of books, and is so still. His toys have been few, and he has never wanted more. For those he possesses, he seems to have contracted a partiality amounting to affection. This feeling, directed towards one or two living animals of the house, strengthens almost to a passion. Mr. Hunsden gave him a mastiff cub, which he called York, after the donor. It grew to a superb dog, whose fierceness, however, was much modified by the companionship and caresses of its young master. He would go nowhere, do nothing without York. York lay at his feet while he learned his lessons, played with him in the garden, walked with him in the lane and wood, sat near his chair at meals, was fed always by his own hand, was the first thing he sought in the morning, the last he left at night. York accompanied Mr. Hunsden one day to X, and was bitten in the street by a dog in a rabid state. As soon as Hunsden had brought him home and had informed me of the circumstance, I went into the yard and shot him where he lay licking his wound. He was dead in an instant. He had not seen me level the gun. I stood behind him. I had scarcely been 10 minutes in the house when my ear was struck with sounds of anguish. I repaired to the yard once more, for they proceeded thence. Victor was kneeling beside his dead mastiff, bent over it, embracing its bull-like neck, and lost in a passion of the wildest woe. He saw me. "Oh, papa, I'll never forgive you! I'll never forgive you!" was his exclamation. "You shot Yorke. I saw it from the window. I never believed you could be so cruel. I can love you no more." I had much ado to explain to him with a steady voice the stern necessity of the deed. He still, with that inconsolable and bitter accent which I cannot render, but which pierced my heart, repeated, "He might have been cured. You should have tried. You should have burnt the wound with a hot iron, or covered it with caustic. You gave no time, and now it is too late. He is dead." He sank fairly down on the senseless carcass. I waited patiently a long while, till his grief had somewhat exhausted him, and then I lifted him in my arms and carried him to his mother, sure that she would comfort him best. She had witnessed the whole scene from a window. She would not come out for fear of increasing my difficulties by her emotion, but she was ready now to receive him. She took him to her kind heart and onto her gentle lap, consoled him but with her lips, her eyes, her soft embrace for some time, and then, when his sobs diminished, told him that Yorke had felt no pain in dying, and that if he had been left to expire naturally, his end would have been most horrible. Above all, she told him that I was not cruel, for that idea seemed to give exquisite pain to poor Victor; that it was my affection for Yorke and him which had made me act so, and that I was now almost heartbroken to see him weep thus bitterly. Victor would have been no true son of his father, had these considerations, these reasons, breathed in so low, so sweet a tone, married to caresses so benign, so tender, to looks so inspired with pitying sympathy, produced no effect on him. They did produce an effect. He grew calmer, rested his face on her shoulder, and lay still in her arms. Looking up shortly, he asked his mother to tell him over again what she had said about Yorke having suffered no pain, and my not being cruel. The balmy words being repeated, he again pillowed his cheek on her breast, and was again tranquil. Some hours after, he came to me in my library, asked if I forgave him, and desired to be reconciled. I drew the lad to my side, and there I kept him a good while, and had much talk with him, in the course of which he disclosed many points of feeling and thought I approved of in my son. I found, it is true, few elements of the good fellow or the fine fellow in him, scant sparkles of the spirit which loves to flash over the wine cup, or which kindles the passions to a destroying fire; but I saw in the soil of his heart healthy and swelling germs of compassion, affection, fidelity. I discovered in the garden of his intellect a rich growth of wholesome principles, reason, justice, moral courage, that promised, if not blighted, a fertile bearing. So I bestowed on his large forehead and on his cheek, still pale with tears, a proud and contented kiss, and sent him away comforted. Yet I saw him the next day, laid on the mound under which Yorke had been buried, his face covered with his hands. He was melancholy for some weeks, and more than a year elapsed before he would listen to any proposal of having another dog. Victor learns fast. He must soon go to Eton, where I suspect his first year or two will be utter wretchedness. To leave me, his mother, and his home, will give his heart an agonized wrench. Then the fagging will not suit him. But emulation, thirst after knowledge, the glory of success, will stir and reward him in time. Meantime, I feel in myself a strong repugnance to fix the hour which will uproot my sole olive branch, and transplant it far from me; and when I speak to Frances on the subject, I am heard with a kind of patient pain, as though I alluded to some fearful operation at which her nature shudders, but from which her fortitude will not permit her to recoil. The step must, however, be taken, and it shall be; for though Frances will not make a milksop of her son, she will accustom him to a style of treatment, a forbearance, a congenial tenderness he will meet with from none else. She sees, as I also see, a something in Victor's temper, a kind of electrical ardour and power, which emits now and then ominous sparks. Hunsden calls it his spirit, and says it should not be curbed. I call it the leaven of the offending Adam, and consider that it should be, if not whipped out of him, at least soundly disciplined, and that he will be cheap of any amount of either bodily or mental suffering which will ground him radically in the art of self-control. Frances gives this something in her son's marked character no name, but when it appears in the grinding of his teeth, in the glittering of his eye, in the fierce revolt of feeling against disappointment, mischance, sudden sorrow, or supposed injustice, she folds him to her breast, or takes him to walk with her alone in the wood. Then she reasons with him like any philosopher, and to reason Victor is ever accessible. Then she looks at him with eyes of love, and by love Victor can be infallibly subjugated. But will reason or love be the weapons with which in future the world will meet his violence? Oh, no! For that flash in his black eye, for that cloud on his bony brow, for that compression of his statuesque lips, the lad will some day get blows instead of blandishments, kicks instead of kisses. Then for the fit of mute fury which will sicken his body and madden his soul. Then for the ordeal of merited and salutary suffering, out of which he will come, I trust, a wiser and a better man. I see him now. He stands by Hunsden, who is seated on the lawn under the beech. Hunsden's hand rests on the boy's collar, and he is instilling God knows what principles into his ear. Victor looks well just now, for he listens with a sort of smiling interest. He never looked so like his mother as when he smiles. Pity the sunshine breaks out so rarely. Victor has a preference for Hunsden, full as strong as I deem desirable, being considerably more potent, decided, and indiscriminating than any I ever entertained for that personage myself. Frances, too, regards it with a sort of unexpressed anxiety. While her son leans on Hunsden's knee, or rests against his shoulder, she roves with restless movement round, like a dove guarding its young from a hovering hawk. She says she wishes Hunsden had children of his own, for then he would better know the danger of inciting their pride and indulging their foibles. Frances approaches my library window, puts aside the honeysuckle which half covers it, and tells me tea is ready. Seeing that I continue busy, she enters the room, comes near me quietly, and puts her hand on my shoulder. Monsieur est trop appliqué. I shall soon have done. She draws a chair near, and sits down to wait till I have finished. Her presence is as pleasant to my mind as the perfume of the fresh hay and spicy flowers, as the glow of the westering sun, as the repose of the midsummer eve are to my senses. But Hunsden comes. I hear his step, and there he is, bending through the lattice, from which he has thrust away the woodbine with unsparing hand, disturbing 2 bees and a butterfly. Crimsworth, I say, Crimsworth, take that pen out of his hand, mistress, and make him lift up his head. Well, Hunsden, I hear you. I was at X yesterday. Your brother Ned is getting richer than Croesus by railway speculations. They call him in the Peace Hall a stag of 10. And I've heard from Brown, Monsieur and Madame Vandenhuten and Jean-Baptiste talk of coming to see you next month. He mentions the Pelets, too. He says their domestic harmony is not the finest in the world, but in business they are doing on ne peut mieux, which circumstance he concludes will be a sufficient consolation to both for any little crosses in the affections. Why don't you invite the Pelets to Blankshire, Crimsworth? I should so like to see your first flame, Zoraide. Mistress, don't be jealous, but he loved that lady to distraction. I know it for a fact. Brown says she weighs 12 stones now. You see what you've lost, Mr. Professor. Now, monsieur and madame, if you don't come to tea, Victor and I will begin without you. Papa, come. End of chapter 25, part 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. End of The Professor by Charlotte Bronte.